Hey everyone, good morning. I'm talking over the music, I know that. Please I'm going to stop the share, but I think the music keeps going. And we will be turning our attention today to metaphor and conceits, the metaphysical conceits. And in only about half an hour, we're going to have another visitor. Professor Kohlbrenner will join us for a discussion of the philosophical dimensions of all this. I'm glad people are, for the most part, doing well, and I know that this semester, as is the norm, begins to ramp up, and the tasks start to pile up. With that in mind, last week was stressful. I think basically the whole world. I am pleased with how things worked out for us. I think it was the right decision for us to meet in a chat format on Wednesday. I have your feedback from that. People overwhelmingly preferred to meet in person, meaning live like this, but mixing that in does not seem to be a bad idea. And I'll try to do it again. For just, I'll say parenthetically, for my own part, I enjoy doing that. I enjoy the editing. It takes about not quite twice as long, but probably a good 50% or 60% longer than preparing an actual class. In my experience of doing this about over a decade, a regular university class is about 2 to 1, so the preparation time is at least 2 minutes for every minute of instruction. Digitally or pre-recorded, if you're doing it beforehand, it's probably at least 3 to 1. So it doesn't actually save me any time. It doesn't save anyone any time to record, any instructor time to record all the lectures beforehand, but it gives it a different flavor. And I am well aware of how challenging it is for you to sit in front of Zoom all day and not be with people. It's a very difficult thing, and I want to continue commending you. This cohort, the group that you're in, I call it, a lot of my colleagues call it a cohort. Your group is doing very well, and as I told you a couple weeks ago when we started, nobody has done this before, so nobody knows what to expect of how things will continue to play out. But especially this time of year, when this part of a semester, when assignments begin to pile up, the workload begins to become more difficult. Effort is, and your energy, you don't quite have you have some, you're serious about your studies, but you don't have that enthusiasm, the nerves, the anxiety of that first week. So keep doing that. Keep trying to maintain your focus, and I will do my share as best I can. My colleagues will as well. With that in mind, we're going to try to gather. I actually have not spoken to Dr. Shupak and the 106 team about this, but Professor Kohlbrenner and I had to convert, and we actually asked Dr. Shupak, we're just waiting for a response, to meet Wednesday after your class. It'll be about the Odyssey this week, after your 193 class, the classical backgrounds, and to have a social gathering. It's kind of thing we would do this time of year anyway. If we were on campus, we'd have like a coffee break, a small social party. We're going to call it the post-apocalypse detox, now that the apocalypse is behind us. So the post-apocalypse detox we're hoping to have on Wednesday at the end of your 193 class. I'll come, Dr. Shupak will come, all online. Everyone will bring their beverage of choice, and hopefully we'll have a chance to hang out. Maybe we'll have a quiz game and just some chance to be with each other. And chocolate, of course, definitely chocolate. We won't have the university-supplied Bar-Ilan standard rugelach. Maybe one of you will make or bring rugelach or dates, whatever it is that you prefer, and we'll have a chance to hang out. That's our plan for this week. In this class, homemade pastries, always appreciated. So it's good to see everyone this morning. We do have a fair amount of business. I'm speaking kind of casually now, and I actually am going to send you, because this is also for in my class, we still have the midterm a long way off, so you're not too stressed about that. I'm going to send via audio a statement about grading and workload, just what you can expect from me over the next month and a half, when you will have more. You'll have you're in a rhythm now. You know what to do with the homework. Things start to shift as we get closer to week 8. We're halfway between the beginning of the semester and the midterm. This is a good time, I have always found, to share with you, how I come up with these numbers, how I undertake assessment, my own difficulties with assessment and what you can look ahead to, not with any urgency at this time, but what is on the horizon for us. Okay, so with that in mind, let's learn something now. We have spent a few weeks or a week now. We've spent now this is our third class in which we are discussing metaphor, similes, the whole world of figural language, and on Wednesday we'll talk specifically about imagery, which is they're all cousins. These are all different parts of pretty much the same thing. The word an example of how to tie all this together, and I'm not going to insist today on the differences between these various categories. What we're going to work on today, as you know, is conceit. Since you already have done the hard work of preparing some very difficult, challenging texts, and in a minute I will turn to you and ask you what you got out of those lectures. Since the most of the frontal learning, what I would do in a lecture, you've already done via YouTube and SoundCloud. The poem, the world of this is a figural language is captured for me very crisply and concisely in this poem that is just the beginning of a poem. I mentioned it actually to one or two of you in our private correspondence. This poem right here, read the wind. This is the beginning of a poem called, let me open it here in the Highwayman in a better link. We'll open here. Here we come. The Highwayman of the beginning of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, by Alfred Noyes. The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwayman came riding, riding, riding. The highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. You have three metaphors right away. So this is actually, it's a fun poem. It's about, it's like a, deceitful late night ne'er-do-wells, bandits and so on. The wind was a torrent. You know what torrents are from downloading, right? It is a river. The wind was a river of darkness. A river of darkness. You can't have an actual river of darkness. Obviously, the text is speaking metaphorically. The moon was a ghostly galleon. Galleon here is not the currency of Harry Potter, but the galleon being a ship, an old ship. And you can, let me see if I'll open another, I can open another tab here. The moon was a ghostly galleon. You can imagine how at night, when there are clouds and it is a, here it is. I know that someone has posted this. Here it is. The moon was a ghostly galleon. It kind of looks like a ship up there. Here it is. The moon looks like a ship in the sky. So that's metaphor number two. And the third is the road was a ribbon of moonlight. Each of these is ghostly galleon tossed upon the seas, right? It gives a little more detail. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. There was an entire atmosphere set here. There is the imagery, the purple door, the old inn door. There is sort of a world of images, so that's imagery. And there are three, not similes, but specifically metaphors. You guys now have had this drilled into you. I don't need to do this anymore. You've done the homework and you've gotten the idea on a very basic level. And there is the world, the atmosphere of the poem is already set from the outset. Another example, you saw several of these. Stop the share of this. Let's go to number two. The soft what light. This was on your worksheet. You guys all got this right. What light through yonder window breaks, a famous line from Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. It is the east and Juliet is the sun. Her significance, her beauty, her radiance, all there apparent. Sometimes this gets a little weird. Here's a modernist poem from about the same era as William Carlos Williams, from a different writer, T.S. Eliot. I think I mentioned him last week. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The beginning of Prufrock, towards the beginning of it, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. There it's obviously a simile, like a patient. Etherized meaning has been anesthetized, an early form of anesthesia to put a patient out before an operation was either kind of mask, a gas that was given, put over and a mask over your face, how is the evening spread against the sky? Not really personification, but there's a figural element of that the evening is spread out. How is the evening spread against the sky in any way, like a patient upon a table? You can write this in chat. I mean, no one really knows what this simile refers to. The sense of it, of course, is discomfiting. It's scary. There is a sense of vulnerability, of potential pain of a patient being put upon the table in order to fix something, but it is very uncomfortable. There is something odd. There is something disturbing about that image. All that is apparent in that metaphor, but also that poem, the modernist period in general, Prufrock and Eliot's work, are playing with conventions of poetry, meaning they're taking what might have been a conventional or expected metaphor and turning its head by creating a very odd metaphor, by taking the evening, the tenor, like a patient, the vehicle, and stretching our imagination to ask, how are they like each other? It is testing or extending the very presumption, the premise of metaphor. If you guys have any creative readings, maybe you can. I don't know. This was not on week 4, by the way. You can't find this, but you have to hunt for this. This is just an intro. All this was on last week on passages. The last one I gave you for the passages is a funny one. These are just, again, it's kind of like a warm-up, so you don't need to have this. But these were not the poems that you prepared for today. We're going to get to those poems in, sorry, I'm already late by about 4 minutes. The Purple Cow. Purple Cow is a fun one. By Gillette Burgess, also from the late 18th century American poet from upstate New York. I never saw a purple cow. I never hoped to see one. But I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one. That's the whole poem. A 4-line poem. I never saw a purple cow. I never hoped to see one. I'm going to put this in chat so you guys can see it more easily rather than it being blurry on my screen. I never saw a purple cow. I never hoped to see one. But I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one. Has anyone here seen a purple cow? I don't know. Maybe you guys live perhaps closer to nature than I do. I don't think anyone has ever seen a purple cow. What is the purple cow? Again, you could write this in chat. Purple cow. I'll put my own reading of this. What is a purple cow? Perhaps, and don't be shy. A lot of you wrote in your homeworks, in your assignments the last couple of weeks, that I'm afraid of being judged. Don't be afraid. We're all judging each other anyway. Don't be afraid. Just offer your best reading and skip the preamble of, I'm afraid that people will reject this. Purple cow to me is just nonconformism. That's my understanding. Someone who goes against the grain of their society, the grain of their community, of the people they live among. I never saw a purple cow. I never hope to see one, but I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see a purple cow than be one. I do hope to see a red one though. One day, hopefully. The purple cow, nonconformism, someone who doesn't fit in with the others, someone who is outlandish, outrageous. You guys have other suggestions. Our chat is quiet today. Let's see. He's definitely having fun. I said that this is a comic poem. There's no question. No one knows what a purple cow is, but we all have a sense of how to interpret it. And that is my topic for today. We've never seen a purple cow. And that is even madness, good. Nonconformity, maybe the fear, perhaps, or of not wanting to stick out too much. It's kind of fun to see someone walking down the streets in a polka dot green flannel suit, but I don't know if I'd have the courage to be that person. However, the poem, maybe, I'm just suggesting that. You guys certainly can have other ideas. My point is this, that although we have never seen a purple cow and don't know exactly what it is, we do have the ability to begin interpreting it. And that is my topic for today with these conceits. Although, how is exactly a flea like love? Well, it's very complicated. And how is a compass like the conjugal relationship, the sexual relationship between a couple that might be far apart? No one ever knows what these are complicated and unexpected, unconventional metaphors, as I wrote to you. That's what a conceit is. But what we do have is we share as readers, and anyone can do this, anyone can become a reader, we have the capacity to interpret them. And that is what the literature, that's what these texts, that's what the metaphors allow us. They as Shklovsky says, they allow us to see something in a new light. Whether the tenor or the vehicle are familiar to us, purple cow is not familiar to us, that's an unusual vehicle. The I, the speaker here, is just someone speaking like you and me, nothing more known to us, or in some ways unknown to us, than another person. And yet, it lets us understand reality, or understand experience, convey that, have that shock of comedy or horror in a new light, simply through the practice of interpretation. This is what Professor Kohlbrenner will join us in a few minutes to discuss, is that perhaps it is the interpretation, the taking apart, the analysis, and it doesn't always have to be intellectual, it can be an emotional one too, but is the processing, the interpretation of the metaphor that is its generative quality. It invites us to see the world in relationships, in patterns. And we'll be talking about that again in a few minutes. There's also, there was a revision of The Purple Cow by Burgess. He came to resent how popular this poem was, and he wrote a confession a few years later in 1897 upon a background that I wrote. Yes, I wrote The Purple Cow, Burgess wrote. I'm sorry now I wrote it, but I can tell you anyhow, I'll kill you if you quote it. There is, again, another version of hyperbole. Yes, he's a confessing, but it is a mocking. It's an ironic confession laced with hyperbole, laced with exaggeration. He's not really going to kill you, but he doesn't want to hear it anymore. He's heard this poem too much. All right, let's discuss the poems that, not in detail. We're not going to read them. You've had enough about these poems that we prepared for today. The metaphysical poets. You're not responsible now, but I am purposefully giving you a sense of the history of poetry now. We're going to make some order at the very end of our semester of just giving you a thumbnail version of the chronology of poetry. We'll get to that at some point. All that you need to know, you can call them late. They were in the late Renaissance. They were about, again, 400 years ago or so, maybe some a little less. Marvell lived a little after John Donne. They're all some in the years towards the end of Shakespeare's life or a bit after Shakespeare's life. That's when it is. And these metaphysical poets, what I'm suggesting to you now is that they are deeply intellectual. They are also very concerned with, and this was in those videos, they're concerned with the division and the relationship between body and soul, and thus these very intellectual, abstract metaphors connected to our most carnal, meaning bodily, our most physical aspects as sexual beings, is reflective. It's not just that these are sort of dirty poems. They are dirty poems from 400 years ago. And they're also stretching like an elastic band, like a rubber band. They're stretching the bounds of metaphor just like T.S. Eliot is. It's not as if the modernists woke up in the 20th century 100 years ago and said, let's play around with metaphor. Here are, they're all men in this era. Let's play with those definitions. Let's play with those boundaries again, 400 years ago. So this practice has been going on for a while. Now, you read 3 poems. We don't have to go through them we don't even have time to go through them one by one. I usually focus mainly on Valediction, Forbidding Mourning. I find it to be, of these 3 very famous poems, I'm referring to Valediction, Forbidding Mourning, as Alana explained in the audio version, as you heard in the video lecture. This is a poem that is, it's of a form. There are poems of that era saying goodbye, goodbye, my love. It is refers to that abstract, ethereal relationship, as they quoted, the interassured of the mind, careless eyes, lips, and hands to miss. It mocks or denigrates in that line, interassured of the mind, careless eyes. It is claiming a kind of superiority of intellectual relationship, mocking lovers who rely on contact. But then it subverts, this is a good word to know, as I don't think this was used in the videos. It subverts all of that. It undoes it. It kind of interprets itself and shows its own shortcomings, its own pretenses. It's showing how arrogant the end of the poem, the conceit, the complicated extended metaphor of that compass in the final three stanzas undoes the lofty, intellectual, cerebral connection that is posited at the beginning. If this is unclear to you, we can go into it more. And I could also record myself doing this, but I hope that the online, what you already got was enough. This too was an experiment for me. I don't know, I usually do this, what they did in those lectures, and I think they did them very well. Those British teachers, those English lecturers, that's what I usually do in class, but this is what I'm suggesting to you. So good, Sarah's asking a good question. So he subverts the conceit. No, I would suggest that the conceit subverts the early stanzas of the poem. The conceit itself undoes the kind of, let's look at it again, and you can ask a question, and Sarah, and I'm going to go to the share screen. We'll look at it together for a moment. But there's this poem, The Flea, and the flea is doing something quite similar actually, and to his coy mistress. All these poems together, the metaphors, and this is our purpose for today, the metaphors, the metaphorical language, the whole figural, very abstract, complicated terminology posits, which means is a way of saying like it puts forth, it suggests a kind of elevated, very learned, intellectual, very poetic, old-fashioned kind of ideal form of love. Each of these three poems suggests that. And then if you read the poems carefully enough, and they are demanding a high degree of effort, just like Dickinson does, they're demanding to be interpreted carefully. If you look at these metaphors, and it's all through the conceits, and I can walk you through with the compass, simply because it's the one that I like and know best. The compass suggests, or it reveals, it subverts that pretense of ideal love. Let me explain this in somewhat simpler terms, and then I'll open up to you guys. I am curious what you guys got out of it, and Professor Colburn will be with us in just a few minutes to talk more about why do this? Why speak in complicated, masked ways? What is the payoff of metaphor? And Shklovsky will come into it too. So here in Forbidding Mourning, a medium-length poem, not a super short one, not a very terribly long one. You heard the audio lesson doing the simple overview of it. You heard the third part, and you guys, if some of you did, maybe you watched all of it. There was actually 45 minutes of that same teacher from England teaching all of it. I asked you guys just to watch the end, focused on the metaphor. Virtuous men pass mildly away. The valediction form, saying goodbye to his lover, his wife, his mistress for a while, his woman for a while. The speaker says, leaving each other should not be a problem. We are like virtuous men. We are like holy men. We have no problem leaving each other. We have a higher form of love, to tell the laity of love. There are several metaphors there already, the earthquakes, the changing of the spheres. But our love is not like dull, sublunary lover's love, kind of playing on the L sound, something we'll talk about in 2 weeks. It's called alliteration, whose soul is sense. We don't need to touch the sense of our fingers. We don't mind being apart from each other because the things which elemented it, because we have something stronger that builds up our love. The things which elemented it. We have a much more refined love, like Alana was saying, with the finely beaten out gold plate, the gold leaf. Think of fancy roofs of spectacular palaces, or in fancy calligraphy of the Middle Ages, that gold leaf, which becomes even more precious the more thin and spread out it is. And so we can be separated to a thin area. Everything in those first 4 stanzas, we have no problem being apart. The other element I'll just share with you now, because I might forget it as Professor Colburn joins us, is that I was also reading this in a new light, against Corona, as everything is against Corona for us nowadays. This is a poem about we have no problem being remote, being distant from each other. Our connection, our social connection, endures. We can maintain. I'm just going to go to each other so I can see your faces. I'm going to stop the share for a second. But what it is positing is exactly what some people suggest during this impossible, unprecedented year, that it is no challenge. It is a small matter for us not to touch, not to be together, to a thin airiness, to be separated. In fact, there might even be a benefit. Some of you are in other countries. We couldn't do that if we had to all be sitting in the same cramped, very uncomfortable room. I guarantee you, whatever you're sitting on, even if it's your bed, it is more comfortable than the chairs you'd be sitting on at Bar Ilan. How wonderful that is. We are all cerebral. We are all such intellectual people. You can roll out of bed and start thinking profound thoughts. That is also what this poem is saying. I don't miss you because our relationship is so sublime, is so elevated. And then the last three stanzas. So I see you guys are a little tired, but it looks like you are with it. Let me know if I'm going too fast or if this is too arcane, too abstract. If they be two, our two souls, which are one. That's here he sets it up in the last four, and then the conceit is only in the last three stanzas. Our two souls, that is the tenor, right? That's what he's talking about. He's talking about our two souls, which are one, even when we're separated from each other. Though I must go, I have to go on this business trip. I have to go somewhere. I'm being sent somewhere. They endure not yet a breach. There's no separation. Social distance is not important to us. Just speaking to our friends on Zoom, here he's talking through a poem. It's a little more, I would argue, even though it's not as technologically complex, it is equally intellectually or conceptually complex. We maintain our relationship, but an expansion like gold to thin airy to airy thinnest bead. And I'm reading that metaphor itself about our connection, which he's comparing to gold. I'm comparing to our own situation here. Airy thinness. What's more than Wi-Fi? All of us. Airy thinness bead. Our two souls, if they be two, they are two. How are they two? They are two like the stiff twin compasses are two. You've heard this is now the third or fourth time you're hearing this explained. They are like the two parts of that machuga, of the compass, right? The thing that you were talking about, that you saw either in pictures or that you looked up yourselves. Your soul, the fixed, you stay where you are, you make no show to move, but if the other do, you only move when the other one does. You sit in the center, I roam around the edge, the circumference of the circle, and it leans and harkens after it. It gets even more complicated. This is an absolutely crazy metaphor, but our two souls remain two, the way that we are linked. I go around the circumference, I tell you the radius, all the things that you had in that video. But what about it leans and harkens after it and grows erect as that comes home? So you are to me, like the other foot obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just and makes me end where I begun. Now, unlike the flea, this is not, and to his coy mistress, which are entirely about seduction, which are entirely about trying to get the addressee, the maiden to whom those poems are addressed, into his bed. Here he's already been in bed with the addressee. He already enjoys an intimate, probably marital relationship with the addressee, his wife, seemingly. But he's saying, I have no problem. We can be apart. We'll still be, because we have such an elevated, we are not those dull sublunary lovers. How then is this at all sexual? How is this like the other two poems? Well, it is actually entirely of the same sort. John Donne, author of The Flea, is just as dirty here as he is in The Flea.
I thought this was a religious university, Dr. Feldman.
I know. Don't. This is where we get to PG-13 territory, Professor. The firmness, the erect, the running, right? The entire vocabulary of that conceit, the building blocks, how that conceit is portrayed, subverts. This is to answer Sarah's question. It undoes that seemingly rather haughty pretense that we don't need to be each other. We don't need to be with each other. And I was just comparing, Professor Kohlbrenner, this poem to how I read it in our unprecedented days of Corona, that we don't need to be together. We have such an intellectual, abstract, such an elevated relationship that we can just speak, and we have that airy thinness. Wi-Fi being that airy thinness come to life, not in gold. And at the end, he's saying the metaphor makes clear what his words do not. The words of the metaphor make clear what his explicit meaning, the non-metaphorical meaning, does not. The metaphor reveals the truth. in the way that the non-metaphorical language, sort of the screen language, seems to hide. On the surface, he's saying one thing. Metaphorically, he's saying something different. My erection, my yearning, my physical longing, his what's the word? His horniness for her, right? Shows that he cannot withstand the separation any more than can his speaker, same author, can his speaker in the flea sucking on both of them. It's just as erotic, it's just as physical, embodied, and carnal. And all of that, of course, comes only from the metaphor. If you ask him non-metaphorically, he can't admit any of it. Just as the speakers of last week's poems were saying, it's through metaphor that they can reveal. It's through this guise of symbolism that they reveal their true selves. So the metaphor, one can say, is like a lie. It's like it's a distraction. But it's kind of through metaphor that we expose ourselves. Do we not, Professor Kohlbrenner?
I'm glad I didn't expose myself the same way you did this morning.
Well, it's not like that guy on the New Yorker a few weeks ago, literally, on a Zoom call, exposing oneself.
Hi, Curtis. Hello.
Yeah. So
hi.
Let me
I just saw your.
Hold on a second.
I just saw your.
Good. Okay. So, Professor Kohlbrenner, we're talking today about the paramorphs. You heard that's the end of the intro. That's the end of our dealing with the. Now, you guys, so what the students said, I did not teach these poems in detail. I asked them to go through them with other teachers in England and watch videos to get their whole sense of it. I just did my last little part, the subversion, the subversive element of poetry. And here we are to talk with everyone, and everyone's welcome to join in. But Sarah has a specific historical question. Was this erotic poetry accepted, or was it more spiritual? You can read about the metaphysical. The metaphysical poets are very interested in the body and soul. That's part of what they're interested in. But I see that also as metaphorical. The metaphysical relationship between body and soul is kind of like metaphor to the tenor vehicle relationship between metaphor and reality. Or do you understand my points, Sarah, or everyone, or anyone?
I would maybe just pick up on what Sarah said, because we'll be studying this period together in next year, God willing. I mean, Donne is really very, very radical in this respect, and he creates a whole school of poetics in which it's acceptable to write erotic poetry. But he's not only writing erotic poetry, he's doing so in a way which will break other conventions as well. You'll see in other poems by Donne that he'll write about erotic poetry using, forgive the term, a kind of spiritual metaphor. He'll compare erotic experience to spiritual experience. And later critics of the 18th century, when they look back on Donne and all the people that he influenced, and he influences a lot of people, they'll ask, why is it that Donne is taking these very, very, why is he, and here's the money quote from Dr. Johnson, who is an 18th century critic. He says of Donne, and it's a highly critical remark, that he takes the most heterogeneous ideas and yokes them by violence together. And Exhibit A, actually, is this poem. That is, what do lovers and compasses have to do with one another? So Dr. Feld, we'll spend a lot of time kind of thinking about that. Why does a poet like Donne turn to such strange or unlikely metaphoric vehicles in order to express what he wants to express?
Yeah, we can open up to everyone. I mean, we read a very small sample from Victor Shklovsky, who offers that line that I've loved for years, decades since I've read it, to make the stone stony again, to return that urgency, the immediacy of experience precisely through the mediation of metaphor.
Right.
And language, this wonderful property that we are talking about, we spent our first couple weeks, last 3 weeks, talking about the artistry of language, the difference or the variance of poetic language from ordinary language. What ordinary language has, I suggested in this class, and this is my understanding of it, is an efficient medium. It is constantly it's striving for clarity. I'm doing so right now, trying to smooth out all the edges. it is trying to make itself into a kind of medium of thought, as if the words aren't even there. You are grasping my drift without even having to translate my words. Many of us are speaking through here a second or third language.
And
metaphor is slowing all that down.
And we don't always understand, or we don't always remark on the extent to which we use metaphor. I had wanted Dr. Feldman to talk to you about the election, and I was really hoping there's a pedagogical point here. I was really hoping that Biden would that it would be a blowout or a landslide, but he really just squeaked by. He just barely beat him, right? I mean, you see that in that. Oh, you have the American flag there, Daniel, very nice. But you see in that one sentence, I put in 4 metaphors, right? Blowout, landslide, beat him, squeak out, right? Even beat him, which we don't think is a metaphor, is in fact a metaphor. It's a dead metaphor because we use it so often that we're not even aware that it's a metaphor. In the past, I sometimes ask my students just to pick up see how long ago it was, to pick up a Time magazine, which still exists in some form, and to just go through a paragraph and to see how many times in one paragraph you see metaphors being used. I like what Dr. Feldman said, but I always go back to Aristotle, which I just put in our chat, which I think it's useful, and it's a slightly different approach to what Dr. Feldman says. Metaphor is usually thought of as the trope of transference. Transference here is being translated from the Latin, from the Greek, which is translatio. Translatio in Latin means to carry over. So metaphor is the trope of carrying over, in which the unknown or the half known is described and clarified through recourse to what is better known. One more time, in which the unknown or half known is described and clarified through recourse to what is better known. So there's something that I can't express before about the description of the American election, and I can't express it quite the way that I want to. So I try, and that's the unknown. The better known is the landslide, the blowout, the squeaking out, or the beating. And here, and I'll just give you one more thing from Aristotle. This is not from the Poetics, which was where people usually look, but from the Rhetoric. And we'll look at that just quickly because he gives an example of that, which goes back to what Dr. Feldman was saying. Here we go. Now, strange words simply puzzle us. Ordinary words only convey what we already know. It is from metaphor that we can best get hold of something fresh or new. When the poet calls old age a withered stalk, he conveys a new idea, a new fact to us by means of the general notion of lost bloom, which is common to both things. I was studying this with some of my graduate students last week, and I was thinking that withered stalk as a metaphor, it adds something to the language. It not only adds the metaphor itself, it adds an understanding. That is, once we have withered stalk, we have a way of understanding old age which we never had before. That's why poetry and metaphor is so important, not only because it gives us new ways to name things we know, it gives us ways of naming things that we don't know yet that we do know, and that by using metaphor, we identify something in the world which we hadn't seen before. And that, I think, is the urgency of poetry. And what happens in a world without poetry is we lose the ability not only to express ourselves, but to see things. That metaphor helps us see the world, understand the world. Poets help us do that. That was I didn't even prepare that.
This all falls in, as Tamar concurs. This falls obviously Aristotle's living 2,000 years before Shklovsky, but it's from the same thrust, same gist of thought, that poetry adds density to language. It makes it a richer texture. And by using that to refer to experience, emotions, concepts, to reality itself, it makes that too a more rich object of reference. Instead of ordinary language and our ordinary ways of thinking about our own experience, which is constantly thinning things out, not the airy thinness, but it is sort of, it is depriving it of texture, making things more simple.
Dr. Feldman, what's an example of ordinary language? What would you think about today? What's ordinary language?
You're saying, so your point, I take it very well, that the newspaper, which is simply trying to convey a point, often cannot help but rely on metaphor. And I'll bring up, actually, I had last week, but I forgot I had to give you a metaphor about this. But that, a scientific abstract for a drug, for a chemistry, for a new medicine, new discovery in biology, they'll ask you to, and I've had this also in my own world in literature, they'll ask you to cross out all the metaphors. Just tell us what it means. And when we speak of our own everyday feelings, our own plans, we often find ourselves relying on metaphors without wanting to. That is what we call cliche. But it's because we are sort of, we are being depleted of the depth of experience, and metaphor restores that. No?
It's interesting also that when you see the people on the cutting edge, metaphor alert, when you see people on the cutting edges of sciences, that is in physics, especially particle physics, when they get to places that are the most advanced places for particle physicists, they rely upon metaphors: chaos theory, string theory, quantum theory. That is, not even physicists, the theoretical physicists will acknowledge that they're getting to places they don't know. And even to describe what they do know, they have to rely upon metaphors. And the high-end physicists know this. Our colleagues, however, who sit on all the academic committees at Bar Ilan, they don't know this, right? The people who judge the abstracts, they don't know this. They believe in the simplicity and transparency of language. They somehow think, which is very strange, that language by itself can convey reality. And I think that's not a dangerous idea, but it's as Dr. Feldman said, it's a thinning idea. It thins our experience. It takes things off the table. It doesn't allow us to see things that are not empirically there. That's the world that we all live in now. If you don't, show me, let me see it. And if you can't see it, and if you can't show me, it's not real. And we all sense now, and I think this is a big part of our pedagogy, a big part of our teaching now during the time of Corona, we all sense, because things are so fragile, that we all sense that there's a lot out there that we really can talk about, and that we need a poetic language for. That we need a poetic language to describe something that we sense is there, but that all of those other languages, political and scientific, and especially technological, they don't get it. They don't give it to us. One of the greatest lines in Shakespeare's poetry is Hamlet says to his friend Hector, "There is more to heaven and earth," to Hector, to Horace, come on, Bill, wake up, Horatio. Hamlet says to, it's first coffee here. Hamlet says to Horatio, "There is more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, my dear Horatio." Horatio is the very well-educated university man in Hamlet. And Hamlet says, as much as you know and as educated as you are, and he is the figure of education in the play, there is more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy. And in order to know that, you need to read Hamlet, you need to read poetry. You need to understand metaphor.
In our last couple minutes, let's open to a few comments, and then we'll each have something to say. I posted. Thank you so much, beautiful. I agree with Nicole. Thank you for those beautiful words and that challenging and sophisticated, but also I think very accessible an overview of the philosophical stakes of poetry. I put in the chat two quotes that I enjoy, and I actually meant to present them at the beginning, right when Professor Kohlbrenner joined us. So here they are, two lines from this news-soaked week, this stressful week of the end year.
Can you continue without saying it using any metaphors? Can you continue without using any metaphors, please? You just said soaked.
Yes. No metaphor. We'll speak only referentially, only connotatively. We've also covered, we've read Jacobson. It's difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Difficult to get the news. And Pound saying something quite different. Pound writing, "Poetry is news that stays news." And from a preeminent news academic institute, you can read a whole essay elaborating on that point. I want to give students a chance, since it's difficult to internalize most of this, just a chance to ask questions and comment in response to what we've said today. This hour has kind of flown by. There were a bunch of comments earlier when we were reading Valediction. You can refer either to those poems and make reference to, and try to make reference to, the conversation we've had the last 20 minutes, or just respond to what Professor Kohlbrenner has said. But I want to open the floor to all of you, and then we will have a few final comments before we sign off for today. And you guys can put up your hands either in the participant list on your side, and I will make a list, or just put up your hands physically. Or there's also the thumbs up. That also is a form. 3 ways of interjecting here. Bills, what's the news by you? More news? Some more poetry? We'll just chat amongst ourselves before people.
Well, we're gonna use this discussion. Hopefully, those of you who will be even more alert later on at 2 o'clock this afternoon when we're in class, will use this discussion to think a little bit about how Homer represents the chase of Achilles' chase of Hector.
Well, you still, okay.
Yeah, we're moving on to the Odyssey slowly but surely. And
I shared with the students our plans for the post-apocalypse. Now they're coming out of Calypso's cave, out of Ogygia, the post-apocalypse detox for Wednesday afternoon.
I think we should teach all our classes together, Dr. Feldman.
All right, so I still am waiting to see people. Let's see. I'm gonna go to the other screen. Okay, we have Sarah's number 1, and then anybody else, put up your hands physically or virtually. Your virtual or your real hands. Talk about metaphor. I'll just call on people randomly also. Itamar, you're also gonna have to have a comment. You're number 2. I know you weren't expecting that, but now you are. So Itamar is number 2, and let me see. Amy, I don't know. We haven't met Amy. We have not yet met Amy. Let's see.
Do they know about the random comment wheel, Dr. Feldman, that you've designed?
Oh, there is a random comment group?
No, is there a random comment wheel that you used to put up on the board? And
I used to do that. It induced. I'll share this now with everyone. It induced so much, as we also, and so as we used to, it induced too much panic last year. But I used to have in the past in class.
The students would come to my class afterwards.
I didn't have people pick up their hands, but a wheel that randomly picked people for answering questions, reading, or offering comments. But I can reintroduce it if you guys are stout enough. Maybe it'd be less intimidating in a virtual format. Okay, so Sarah, you're first. You're the one who actually did volunteer. Then Itamar, then Amy Jones.
Okay, I was just wondering with poetry, when we look back, you speak about Odyssey, and I'm really bad at all classical poetry, so I really don't know much. But like when we read Shakespeare, I'm a bit more familiar with Shakespeare, that seeing the old poets and what they write with their old language, which is actually so fresh and new for us today, it's interesting that the old poetry actually gives us new eyes on our reality today. Like even now, when you were comparing the poem of the Dunn's poem with Corona, that was like just such an interesting way of looking at it. So I don't know what your comments are about that as well.
Good. And I just want to jump onto that, Sarah, that point that Sarah makes, Professor Kohlbrenner. I had suggested before you joined us that way you and I speak in our academic conversations, that much of the challenge of poetry is in the interpretation. It's not in the composition, but it's rather how we take it apart. That is the creative and literary reading. It's the way of seeing a world metaphorically in an interpretive posture.
Right. I would just add the way we take it into our world, just as Sarah just said. We take the poetry into our world. We read the poetry. And that's what the advantages are of literary traditions. That's why we're teaching the curriculum that we teach here at Bar-Ilan the way that we do. That's why we read all of this old stuff. I mean, one is to see the way in which, and I posted the poem by Catherine Phillips, who was a writer 50 or 60 years after Donne. And she's writing about feminine friendship, which itself is very radical for her period, right? And she's appropriating the metaphor, the conceit that Donne uses, which is a hierarchical metaphor. And she's using it to describe a kind of egalitarian feminine friendship, which is just, so she takes the poetry, she takes Donne's poem and the experiences that are implicit in that, and she does exactly what Pound says, is she makes it new. She uses the same conceit, I mean, not exactly the same. She takes it, and in a way, I like Aristotle's term of translatio, translation. She translates it for her own purposes. And through that, and really through that, that's why poetry is so important, she helps make other experiences possible. Meaning it's not only that Phillips is writing poetry about feminine friendship because that's what's happening during the period. Her poetry enables that to happen. She provides a language for that to happen, for the idea of friendship to be understood in this kind of sublime way. To think of friendship in that way.
So in that way, poetry also creates reality.
I think that's what we were saying. I think that's what Dr. Feldman apparently was saying with Shklovsky, who I have not read, but I was saying before with Aristotle.
Okay, thank you. Itamar, Amy, and then we'll move to our conclusion.
I think, well, I agree with the idea that poetry is very useful for saying things that could not be said with the ordinary language. But in my view, it is also very useful in saying things that could be said more simply. Because in a way, it's like when you tell a child, don't touch the fire, he'll go ahead and touch it. But when only after he learns from his own experience, the message really is inscribed deeply in his brain. So it's kind of the same with metaphor. When I am forced to find my way into the message myself,
That's a
when
very
the message is created inside of me and not delivered to me, it is much more powerful.
That's a very sophisticated comment. I'm reading with my students in the second year, Sidney's Defense of Poetry, and he talks about metaphor as a speaking picture and how metaphor or poetics does more, really going, he says, Sidney says that poetry is better than philosophy, and this really parallels what Itamar says, because philosophy is like that abstract statement. Poetry is you feel it. It's in front of you, it's a picture, you feel it, it's present to you.
That actually sounds like there is for me, I have to go back and read Sidney again, but there might be a discrepancy between Sidney on the one hand and Shklovsky's theory of metaphor on the other. Shklovsky, in the early Soviet period, about 100 years ago, he disagrees with the notion that poetry is simply speaking words, and he questions, he interrogates the notion that the point of metaphor is to offer an image that facilitates thought. In fact, it's meant, and he's obviously a fan of like Kandinsky, of non-figural imagery that slows down thought. It's not that we turn into a movie, we turn into a picture, we turn into a photograph, we turn into a GIF clip that makes it so much easier to grasp the notion of a long distance relationship. That is all that John Donne is talking about in Valediction, or of yearning to consummate a new love, the way that Marvell is talking about in Coy Mistress, or that Donne is talking about in The Flea, but it rather slows it down. Let's actually analyze. Let's make it more rich. Let's make it more complicated, and therefore make us dwell upon this more. It's not to paper over and to speed up thought, rather to slow down thought. Last comment, Amy Jones, and then if anybody else has another comment, you guys are welcome to ask. We are about done. No John Donne, but done. Amy, please, let's hear from you. Welcome.
Thank you. Wow, I don't already know what else there is to be said.
Throwing you into the deep end.
I feel like metaphor like maybe came around, like as everybody has said, to talk about taboo subjects, and I wonder if it would, like, if everything was always like appropriate to be said, like also like 400 years ago, would metaphor really even be like used today? Like I know it would have, like it's beautiful language and whatever, but would be so prominent. Do you know what I mean? Like if you could always just say what you mean and there would be no taboo subjects, would you need
as
metaphor?
A concept or a specific metaphor? Like, do you mean like, does metaphor as a category die out, or do specific metaphors like Juliet is the sun, my love is a red, red rose? Those are metaphors that were created in the Renaissance that pretty much have lived their life, and unless you're quoting Shakespeare, they no longer endure. So which one do you mean? That a specific metaphor has a lifespan and then it dies out, it turns into cliche? Or whether metaphors in general, metaphorical language, figural language, is an invention, has its utility, and now is kind of archaic in our own time even?
I mean metaphors in general. I don't think it's totally archaic because it's beautiful to speak in metaphors. But I mean today, especially, there's nothing that you can't say. Like there are things that people will be like, oh my God, but there's nothing that you need to hide in deeper language.
Okay, so Bill, I'll give you a chance. Professor Coleman, you can reply. I'm sure Sarah is happy to hear another South African class. Are you also in South Africa?
Yeah, from South.
Okay, all right.
From
You guys
South
can
Africa.
You can meet up. Sarah, you're in South Africa also, correct?
No, not
Okay, you
in.
guys
I
can
don't know
have
if there's a class that's South Africa, but I'm from.
Yeah,
So.
you guys, it's our southern contingent. Our southern contingent.
I mean, I have a lot more to say about that, but I think a lot of it is for next year. When we redone it, it's a really, I think, you know, you did a great, beautiful reading of it, but we'll spend in class like a whole class period on it, because it really, the way that Dunn expresses himself, the reading that Dr. Feldman provides, that it's a way of kind of hiding. To me, it's also a way of expressing that. If you look at the poem really, and every poem by Dunn, and I think this is useful to think about for reading 17th century poems. And by the way, you have to put away this idea that somehow they were like less sophisticated than we are, or less, their ability to talk about things that are off the table for us is much easier than for them. Meaning sexuality is always on the table for them. They're much freer in sexual terms in writing. Shakespeare, Donne, all of them, even Milton, who's a Puritan poet. So what's useful in reading those poems, I wonder how much this works in later periods. Whenever we teach these poems, I always look at it as a dramatic situation. And the dramatic situation, and a lot of 17th century poetry, especially Donne, is really related to drama of the period. That Shakespeare and Donne are contemporaries. So you have a guy trying to convince a girl, that's what Dr. Feldman said. And what happens as the course of this poem is he keeps on providing metaphors, and they're all insufficient, right? He's saying, I'm leaving, bye-bye, right? But we're still together. And she keeps on saying, even though she says nothing in the poem, give me a break, right? He gives, I think, 2 or 3 metaphors in which he tries to pull it over on her, that somehow we're still together, even though we're apart. But the poem does end, and the twin compasses do work. So there's something about those twin compasses which make it, which I think in reading the poem, they're satisfying. The other ones, the gold to airy thinness beat, right? She's like, give me a break. You're there, I'm here, right? What did you go over that gold to airy thinness beat? Yeah, right. I mean, I don't know when I was
not in huge detail, as Tamar pointed out, there was more to it. The elements, the elemental side. But yes,
just for 2 minutes, because I went when
yes.
in the 70s, my father had a jewelry company, and this is the glory days of the company. And I remember he went to something called the 24 Karat Club in Manhattan, where all the big jewelers went, whatever, watchmakers, jewelers, and the story was always of the cake that would be brought out at the end, which had gold leaf on it, meaning this is like pure conspicuous consumption. Edible gold leaf. So gold leaf is gold to airy thinness beat. It's beat so thin, it's just the sign of wealth, that you can actually use it for the cake. So how is it being used by Donne here? He's saying we're really one thing, right? Where does it come out? I mean, let's see.
Our two souls, therefore,
our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, right? I'm out of here. Endure not yet a breach, but an expansion like gold to airy thinness beat. And here's the dramatic part of the poem, right? Because there's silence. And just like you have to make a screenplay for Homer, you have to make a much shorter screenplay for Donne. And you have to look at the expression on the face of the woman, who never gets to speak, by the way. And her expression, I would say, in our short movie version is, give me a break. You're there and I'm here. And how do we know that? Because the next line is, if they be two, right? If they be two, meaning he says we're one. And her give me a break face says, what are you talking about? We're two. If they be two, and then he tries again. They are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul the fixed foot makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. Now, what are these twin? What is the characteristic of compasses? Why, if you were to talk back to the 18th century, who says to Donne, come off it, compasses and lovers, what do they have to do with each other? So what do compasses and lovers have to do with each other? Why is this a good metaphor? Why does the woman here not continue talking? Why is she, as it were, in his mind, satisfied with this image? So you know what these twin compasses are. It's like a thing you used in geometry in 10th grade, right? Not the compass where you know where you're going, but obviously, right? We just talked about that. So why are lovers like compasses?
Professor Kohlbrenner,
Yeah.
perhaps I read this incorrectly or differently, but I know you say it's like as if she says, give me a break, but yeah. I kind of saw the compass as a compliment, as in like, saying to his wife, you're there at the center, you hold me down, you're like strong for us, even though I'm traveling around you, you're like, without her, he wouldn't be able to travel. Like the relationship between the
How do you know they're married? It's such a Bari line reading. Oh, they're always married. I'm not sure they're married. I mean, I hear that, but I'm just looking at the dialogue. If they be two, meaning he has to concede to what she just said. He just said, oh, we're just one. And in between, I'm reading between the lines in which she says, we're not two, we're not one, we're two. And he concedes and he says, if they be two, they are two, as stiff twin compasses are two. So I'm just really asking you, why is this a good metaphor? Why could you, I mean, really in the 18th century, they asked the question that we're asking, compasses and lovers? Come on, what are you talking about?
I think Danielle Stephen might have a comment. Danielle?
Sorry, yeah.
Like, yeah, just pretty much what everyone's saying, but I'm actually intrigued about the word stiff twin compasses. Because that makes, like, we think compass, okay, you've got the starting point, they're together, and you can draw a circle, whatever, circle of life, all this stuff. But the fact that it's stiff, it means, I don't know, for me, that there's like a restriction. It's not, when they're two, it's less mobile, you know?
I think there's still I think there's the eroticism and the sexuality there. They're here, it's shared. It's interesting how the rest of the poem, the erectness is assigned to the feminine, which is weird. But that's just Donne being playful, I think. But I would just ask you again to think conceptually, and that's what Donne's metaphorical conceits, and you've been talking about that, I assume, that's what Donne's metaphorical conceits do, is they force you beyond the visual. Meaning you'll see poetry up until Donne is very visual. It's like a guided tour poetry. What you see is what you get. If you stick with the vehicle and you take it literally, like what? So what is that's really just a question I'll leave you with, and you can pick it up, or we can pick it up next year. Is what is the efficacy? Why are these twin compasses? Why does it work? Why is it not just some kind of like crazy metaphor, which is what people will say later on? Why is it suitable?
Anybody have an idea, or should we offer our own? Because we've already thought about the answers because we're asking the questions, but you guys can pipe up.
Surely all metaphors work. There's no such thing as a crazy metaphor.
No, of course there is, right? Of course, a crazy metaphor is. If I talk to you, they're inappropriate metaphors. And in this period, there are people who talk. Donne has a contemporary, Ben Jonson, not the humiliated Canadian sprinter, but Ben Jonson was a poet, and he was writing really against Donne, and said, if you're talking about religion, don't bring metaphors from the bawdy house, by which he meant the house of prostitution, right, from the whorehouse. And he's really aiming right at Donne, because Donne in other poems, when he talks about religion, talks about sex. So I hear what you're saying. Maybe we're more open-minded, but I think there are even places where we would say that the metaphor is not just or fit, but I think there's something about Donnean metaphors which makes him such a great poet, in which the conceits suddenly make sense. What looks like is crazy.
Night. That's Elmi. I think that's pushing the bounds of metaphor. It's asking you, does this metaphor still work? And he's pushing the envelope, which itself is a bad metaphor, but saying, can you still make any sense of this? Or are these two elements, the vehicle and tenor, so disjointed, so disjuncted that I'm simply playing with you?
So I would just ask you. I know students hate to go over, and you only have a 1 hour class. Class is officially over.
Yeah, usually I end around now. My answer for the compass is usually that this is a metaphor for metaphor. That these are the two sides. The tenor is the fixed point in the middle. It is reality. It's what we have. It's the object that's being illustrated and depicted and represented, and then the vehicle is the other. What's the word they use? The other foot obliquely run. That it roams around, it stretches reality, it stretches experience, it stretches meaning. It describes the circumference of language, and that the compass itself is metaphor.
I just have to give the last word because I didn't understand that. I'm just saying that's very complicated what Dr. Feldman just said, and I have to think some more about it. Not that it's not understandable, but it's difficult. For me, it's much simpler. That is where the whole poem is a meditation on whether people can be separate whether people can be together when they're separate. And the
It's what we
poet,
are doing here.
exactly what you said before. Exactly what you said before, right? That's it. That's everything is beat. Exactly what you said before. And since it's a meditation on whether two people who are separate can be together, it's a meditation on love, right? And the twin compasses works because it is something that is double, but it is single. There are 2 feet which are separate, but they come together at the top. Is it 1 or is it 2? It's both, right?
Let alone 40 people here. Each of us.
What's that?
Feet.
That's why the metaphor works, because it's and that's why it's so called satisfies her, because it acknowledges their separateness and their difference, because true love without acknowledging difference is not love, right? Love without acknowledging difference is just conquest, right? It acknowledges differences, but it also shows the way that they're together.
Noah, I'm going to take your question afterwards. I'm going to let people go. I want to say, Professor Kolben, we always compete over who can have the last word, but I'd be happy to speak with more people afterwards. In Professor Kolbenner's wonderful interpretation, his reading of that seminal, the key part, well, I guess seminal is also good for this. It's a good good imagery for this particular poem.
A religious university, Dr. Feldman. I keep on telling you.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to remember. The 2 as 1 reminds me, and this is my last comment, reminds me of what we read in that essay, I guess, 2 weeks ago, of Kenneth Koch, saying that 2 + 2 = 4 makes sense in mathematics, but you can say 2 + 2 = blue, and that can be poetry. Saying 2 as 1, 2 as 1, there is a voice of poetry in this text, the speaker, Donne perhaps, and there is a voice of reality, the one at home, perhaps if it is a marriage situation with the kids, or the one who is going to have to face the opprobrium of having been in an extramarital relationship if it's not, but the voice of, come on, real, the reality principle in psychoanalytic terms. And to hear those kinds of connections, 2 + 2 or 2 + 1, what can 2 be 1? Can 2 + 2 equal blue? To hear those resonances, and obviously Kenneth Koch is not at all referring to this poem when he writes that, but I hear those resonances. And part of what metaphor does for us is to infer and perceive relationship when others might not. And actually, I'll give you the final word. But that is what I think we are always striving to do as readers of literature, to see patterns, to discern comparisons, to relate unlike things, and to understand their relation. Of course, the most unlike thing are 2 people, or all of us, how we see the world, so similar and yet also so profoundly different. And using language, this shared vessel, this shared medium, to make ourselves understood to someone else, to make the patterns, to make the relationships evident, to make those comparisons clear and visceral, to make them felt. That's what Shklovsky's talking about, that's what metaphors are talking about, and that has been our purpose of today. Bill, you'll have the final word, then I'll break.
My final word is I'm just so grateful to be able to be part of this conversation, Dr. Feldman.
Thank you. Well, I'll see you guys in Ogygia, in Calypso's cave, a no place, on your way back from Troy in a couple of days. All right, I'm stopping the cloud, and you guys can get ready for your next class. And I'm sticking around for further conversation with anyone. Thank you so much, Professor Kolbenner. It's been a pleasure.